Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast. You're in the right place if you're a growth-seeking being who acknowledges the challenges and delights of your humanity on the path to an ever more conscious life. If you want to feel inspired to love and accept yourself, to feel free to be and express you in all your brilliance, if you want to truly value yourself and others and feel energized and alive both at home and in the world, then sit back and take a breath as you explore and grow the brilliance of your beautiful human self with your host, the father of non-personal awareness and creator of the MPA process, Joel Young.
Hello, and welcome to episode 43 of the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. I'm delighted you're here. I've got a special something for you today. Because I've got Boundary Bootcamp coming out soon, I wanted to talk a little bit about boundaries and what are boundaries. And I realized that one of the videos that's included in the program is a really clear kind of set of distinctions about what is a healthy boundary and what is not. And I wanted to sort of give it to you, share it with you here on the podcast, because, I am passionate about boundaries. I think it's such a major thing in people's lives. When you have an issue with boundaries, it can sap away at self-esteem. It can create all sorts of issues in relationships. And I think one of the sort of main resistances to really looking at your boundaries are some of the myths and misunderstandings about what boundaries actually are. So in today's episode, you're going to get a really clear definition of, how I would encourage you to define a boundary. And through those myths, it'll explain to you sort of, where we get these ideas that sort of it's a bad thing, it's a dangerous thing, and how you can get clear on what is a healthy version of a boundary, because that in itself is going to give you, really, I hope it's going to open the doors in your mind to how when you start to come into the clarity around healthy boundaries, it doesn't have to be so scary. Yes, it can be a challenge to really get through some of the emotional dross that we've got around it. And that's where Boundary Bootcamp comes in. But I really hope that today's episode gives you something that will help you to sort of just get a clearer sense of how you can be so free and give freedom to others when you start looking at what is a healthy boundary versus what is an unhealthy boundary. So for this episode, I'm going to hand you over to that. It is a video, but I've just taken the audio for the purposes of this episode that goes deeply into it. And again, if you're here for the first time, I've just dived into the content already. I love that you're here. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button wherever you are. And if you do want to get hold of Boundary Bootcamp, when this is going out today, it'll be a little while, a week or so, maybe 2 weeks from now. But if you want to be notified when it goes live, you just need to go and get on the Boundary Bootcamp waitlist, which will be on the show notes for today, which will be www.beabrillianthuman.com/43. You'll find links there. You'll also find links on my main website, joelyoungmpa.com, so you can have a look at that. One good reason to get on the waitlist now is I'm launching, and when I do launch it, I'm going to sort of give an insane offer, is that what I call it. A really good offer for a short period of time as I launch it. And then it will, of course, become available at the full price and without the details of that special offer. So if you want to make sure you don't miss it, get on that wait list now, and just go ahead. You can go to the show notes and find the links there. So without further ado, I hand you over to a portion of Boundary Bootcamp. Hello, so in this video I want to cover, as the title says, some key distinctions. want to go into sort of some boundary fundamentals with you. Now, it's worth saying that I don't necessarily have the definitive answer. I'm just really offering you the perspectives as I've come to understand it, and also so that we have a basis of understanding from which to work from as we go through the course. And of course, there is a we factor in this, because it may be that, because I don't have necessarily all the answers, that you may have ideas and understandings that you can offer. And the Facebook group, of course, is a great space to do that. So in this video, we're going to cover basically what are boundaries, what they're not, what's the root of unhealthy boundaries, a really simple understanding of how you can identify where they're crossed or what works for you. And also I want to cover some of the myths that are commonly surround boundaries in general, so that we can really open up the whole topic. So let's start with, what are boundaries? So boundaries in essence are guidelines for how you relate to yourself and to the rest of the world. You could call them codes of conduct or rules of conduct, which are built out of a mix of beliefs, opinions, attitudes, past experiences, and your social learning. They operate in two directions, so they affect both the incoming and outgoing interactions between you and others. And they help to define you by outlining your likes and your dislikes. So what's right and wrong for you personally is a matter of your own personal discovery, your own personal choice. And by defining those things, it helps you define literally how you will and won't be treated by others. So most of when we think about boundaries, we think about the aspect of boundaries of incoming stuff. So people do things to us that don't feel good, and they're crossing our boundaries on a sort of outside-inside way. But I just mentioned there, they go in two directions. There's another form of boundary crossing, which is called distancing. So this is particularly pertinent to close, intimate relationships, for example, where you have a commitment in a relationship and someone moves away and crosses the boundary, goes outside of the commitment. That's a way of boundary crossing by distancing. Or even in terms of simple, the silent treatment as an example, is in a sense a boundary crossing, because in the commitment to, or the what feels good to you as communication and openness, if someone repeatedly then stops communicating, that's not going to feel good to you. So in a sense, they're crossing a boundary by moving out of what feels good to you. So when it comes to defining boundaries, it can get really complicated if you go with the sort of the should and shouldn'ts, or the moralistic, or other people's opinions about what's a good boundary and what's a bad boundary. Now, in the case of morals, or any of these things really, whether you do or don't agree with something, it's very different to, out of a matter of dogma, coming into a space of saying, well, that's a good boundary, that's a bad boundary. And if you think about it, there's all sorts of different boundaries. There are physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, mental boundaries, spiritual boundaries, and sexual boundaries. So let's make it really easy. And the clue was in what I said a moment ago about there being what feels good and what doesn't feel good. Fundamentally, boundaries are as easily defined as what feels good and what doesn't feel good. In essence, you could say that your feelings are your boundaries, or certainly the indicators of them. So if someone says something to you that's basically a bit shitty and you feel hurt, then you just simply know that they've violated your boundaries, and perhaps it's time to reassess how you communicate those and all the things we're going to learn in this course. Similarly, if somebody invites you to a party and you really don't feel like going, but you go anyway, then you've violated your own boundaries. And again, it's time to reassess. So working with your boundaries basically comes down to listening to and being in touch with how you feel. So coming from the perspective of feelings, you can think about a boundary as that line that uniquely define and separates your personal happiness, your personal integrity, your personal desires, your personal needs, and therefore, most importantly, your personal truth from the rest of the universe. Your feelings are yours. They're unique to you, Only you have within your internal makeup the means to define them. And of course, as we're going to keep coming back to in this course, that's always and ever an evolving thing based on context and experience. So I want to talk a little bit about the root of poor boundaries. In essence, if you're unable to hold a boundary or set a boundary, you're unable to stand in who you are. Another way to look at that is you're ashamed of who you truly are. Now, this often starts in childhood, where we become invalidated in our expressions and our feelings. So we go about the business of setting up this false self, which is what I call a survival strategy. It's a survival strategy because it's what we set up in order to survive. Because we wanted to fit in, we wanted to sort of come into line with those ideas that were around us. Because at a very deep human level, we're basically herd animals. So there's an aspect to that of if you don't fit in, you'll be stuck out of the herd, and then you're basically vulnerable and you'll die. That's what happens at a very, very deep level. So of course, there's many different layers and levels of this. From like, really, I'm not being who I am, to there's different levels, different contexts, different places where I'm not quite able to be my full self. So depending on where you are in relation to any parts of your life in that, means always there's work to do. But basically, if there's any thought or worry about what other people think about you, then there's some false self, some false identity really, that is there to be protected. So good questions to ask yourself here is, do I know what I really want? Do I let other people tell me what to think or believe or how to feel? Do I do things that I don't really want to do and say yes when I really want to say no, or say no when I really want to say yes? Am I afraid to let people know how I really feel? And am I afraid of people thinking negatively about me? Invalidation plays such a big part in this, and it's such a common thing, especially in our culture, that we tend to be invalidated as children. We even probably invalidate our own children in what we say. So when you invalidate someone, what you're basically saying is your expression is not true. And it's kind of crazy making. It's a fundamental sort of gaslighting approach that is so common in our society. So an example might be that as a child, maybe you felt angry. Maybe there was some anger. Perhaps, dad was working all the time and you didn't have any sense of his attention. You wanted attention, so you kick up a fuss and are angry. And then he turns around and says, I work all hours God sends for you. Don't you know how lucky you are to have the time that you have with me? Which basically fundamentally invalidates your feelings at the time. And that makes you think, well, maybe it's not real. Maybe it's not true. Maybe this that I am is not acceptable. Maybe I should be ashamed of myself for even having these feelings. And so again, you begin to take up the role of the dismisser internally. So perhaps what you take from that experience is that the idea that anger is fundamentally not okay. And if you're very young, you can begin to build that survival strategy around doing anything you can to protect yourself from feeling anger and have those invalidating feelings all over again. So you might end up building this persona that makes things okay, that is never angry, and maybe there's probably is deep anger underneath the surface, but there's this shell, this false self that's formed that just mutes the anger or makes the situation that caused the anger to be okay. Perhaps it's a sort of a permanent happy smile on your face, but deep down, it's very hard to admit that there may be sort of rage and anger underneath the surface. And of course, this can happen with different expressions and emotions that have been invalidated over time. And of course, as this pattern gets repeated, we become conditioned. We become conditioned by the repeated invalidation, both from external sources, and also we condition ourselves within our own. As we build that false self and act according to it, we condition ourselves, and so the momentum builds, the shell builds, and that becomes the habit, and then becomes accepted as, oh, that's just who I am, that's just the way it is, which is part of what we'll be looking at in this program. It's also worth saying to you that it's not just through childhood that this conditioning can take place. Certainly in adult relationships, I'm going to guess you've experienced sometimes where there are repeated invalidations. I mean, part of healthy communication in relationships is to validate your partner for their feelings. It's not about agreeing with them. It's not about saying that you agree with their perspective, but you can certainly validate that their expression is understandable, or at least there within them. And certainly in toxic relationships, toxic personal relationships, I mean, one of the main games with a toxic person is to invalidate you and get power over you. So we're also going to go a bit more into that in week 4 when we deal with toxic relationships. So fundamentally, my premise is that the root of poor boundaries is a sense of not okayness with being you, that you don't matter, that your expressions are invalid, and the chances are you've been invalidated in various ways and therefore have come to a sense of subtle or not so subtle shame about the expression of who you are, your experience and your feelings. So on the back of talking about the survival strategies, let's talk about what boundaries are not. So one of the things that is a common mistake with the idea around boundaries is that they are a resistance to what is not wanted. So boundaries really have nothing to do with resisting what's not wanted and everything to do with what it is that is wanted. And there's a really big distinction. Resisting what is creates walls. So the difference here, let me give you an illustration. If you imagine one of those electric fences to keep cows in a field, for example. So it's a simple wire, it's quite low, and it's there mostly for people as a signal. Now you can step over it, but it's there and it's passable. That's very different to a fortress with big walls, with gates and guns, and all of those things which are designed to keep things out. And the energy of those two things is completely different. So boundaries, which are not really boundaries, which are designed to resist what is not wanted, generally tend to be phrased in terms of trying to control others. Now you have no control over what other people do. All you can do is state your boundaries for what is wanted and what feels good and what doesn't feel good for you, and let other people have free will to do what they want, or you take care of you by doing what needs to be done to take care of you. So if you've got a wall, and we'll be looking at this in more detail, it may be time to soften that wall and bring it into a more healthy boundary. Because in a sense, a wall or resisting what's not wanted is an unhealthy boundary. And a lot of the confusion around boundaries is the idea that boundaries equate with resistance. And as I've said, that's just not true. It just is a claiming of who you are and what feels good to you. Boundaries really are about freedom, freedom in all directions. People are free to do what they want to do, you're free to do what you want to do, or what feels good is another way to say that. And when you're in resistance, you're really not free. The idea is that if I resist the other person and what they want, then that makes me free. But then you're always in connection to, or at consequence to another. So in a way, you're caging yourself. You're inside that fortress wall, and as unable to get out as you've made it for other people to get in. So this can be a big issue in intimate relationships. If you've got walls put in place, it's very difficult to allow someone close to you. So I'm going to underline this, ladle it on with a trowel. The key here is that boundaries are about you. They're all about you claiming things for what feels good to you and what doesn't feel good to you. Anytime you're going into some externalization around them, you're stepping into the realm of unhealthy boundaries, walls, resistances, and caging yourself. So going from there, let's talk a bit about some of the myths that come out of that, because there's lots of other ideas in the world about what boundaries are, what they're not, and what they mean. So the first one I want to pick is one of my pet peeves, shall we say. It's the spiritual myth around boundaries. Now, you may or may not have experienced this, but I'm speaking to those that maybe have, because it can be very confusing. If you're someone, and I'm going to guess there's a good chance you are if you're on this course, who's undergone the awakening path, perhaps you've got into some deep spiritual ideas. And one of those ideas that I certainly experienced was the idea that I am nothing, I am boundless. This is speaking to your true nature. So That's all well and good, and there is a perspective where that's true, but in terms of living here in this third dimensional human world, which I'm very passionate about, really honouring the human, is that that's just not true. The fact that we exist as an individual means there is automatically a boundary. There's a me here. Here I am. It's undeniable, and you can get cognitive about there being a boundless, true, unconditional, loving nature. But the fact is, I live as me. My perspective, even if I'm having an experience of the vast boundlessness, there's a me here experiencing the vastness. So it's very important to understand that that's a real myth, that you are, who you truly are, is boundless. Again, going back to the idea that we're going to follow what a boundary is based on should or shouldn't, if the spiritual macho, as I like to call it, version of your story is I am boundless, then everything's going to get skewed because you're not going to have those boundaries. I certainly had this experience. It was a huge part of my journey was to come into this spiritual identity of being the guru, the boundless one, the I am nothing, I am no one. But my boundary issues were chronic. I did some awfully self-harming things in the name of boundlessness and wanting to be this person that was living the enlightened thing. It's bullshit, so I'm really calling bullshit on it and encouraging you, if you have those ideas, to really examine where are your personal boundaries. Now, I'm not saying that your boundaries might not encompass a sense of vastness, a sense of relative unconditionality. What I'm saying here is to really understand that there are boundaries. Inevitably, the fact that you have a body, you're in human form, you have a mind that is distinct means there are boundaries. So aligning with that is very different from being slavishly attached to the idea that if I'm my true self, I will be boundless or boundaryless, which is another way to say that. So then let's look at the sort of more cultural myths around boundaries. Now, most of these come under the banner of the idea that boundaries are resistance. And again, we've examined that that's simply not the case, at least in terms of healthy boundaries. So when you start to hold clear boundaries, it's going to invite people to have a clear choice about what they want to do. And if they've had an experience of getting away with doing what they want to do regardless of you, and your boundary challenges it, then you're going to invoke a lot of the myths. And what are they? We all know what they are. You're being selfish, you're being difficult, you're being belligerent, you're being unkind. All of these things are part of the myth that when we step into healthy boundaries, you could be hit by these. Now in week 4, we're going to look in detail at how to deal with those resistances and stay firm in yourself. And frankly, all of those things are not true. Now, if you're in a resistant state and stating that those are boundaries, then maybe you are being unkind, maybe you are being belligerent, maybe you are being difficult. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the truth of healthy boundaries, which really state this is what works for me, this is what doesn't. And you have free will to respond accordingly. Very different thing. And the other area where there are some myths around boundary, bit of a subset really, but in the area of power struggles, this can be particularly prevalent in intimate relationships, although of course it can also work at places like work. So what I'm talking about here is when you use the boundaries, which again are normally in the realm of resistance, as kind of a game. So you get in relationships a sense of tit for tat, point scoring and those kind of things. So they set a boundary, you set a bigger boundary, they set a bigger boundary. None of these really are boundaries, but the idea is I'm taking care of myself by doing this. Now listen to the way I've said that. That's a very different thing. When you start laying down the law in any kind of relationship, on the premise that you're setting your boundaries and taking care of you, that whole energy of laying down the law really is just a game playing. It's a battle. It's resistance. It's fortress building. And so it's not healthy boundaries. In healthy boundaries, the essence of it is love, is freedom. It's simply saying, this is who I am, this is what works for me. In true freedom, you can just say, well, that doesn't work for me, so either you have an option to change it, or I'll just go elsewhere. Very, very simple. So remember, if we're basing the idea of what are our boundaries on our feelings, feelings are fluid things. That's why I've said to you that your boundaries are going to be evolving. They're going to evolve over time. There are different contexts, different relationships, different situations. You will have different experiences which will impact and affect what feels good to you and what doesn't. So it's always good to have these fluid structures or fluid boundaries. Yes, I'm going to encourage you to hold a boundary, but all I'm saying is stay with what feels good to you. Stay true to feel what's good for you. We're going to look at what the fears and difficulties are that have caused you to violate your own boundaries in that regard, but that is the essence of it. So what can you take away from this video? Well, hopefully that we're going to base our boundaries on feelings, what feels good, what feels doesn't. That boundaries are not about resistance, they're about really stating who you are. That perhaps there are survival strategies that have kept you from expressing and holding those healthy boundaries over time, that they're going to evolve, and that there are some myths that in a way are flags in themselves. So there we go, that's my premise for what are healthy boundaries. Next up, we're going to be looking at the red flags and identifiers. So really looking at what are the areas in your life where the boundary issues are showing up, because that will set us up for the self-assessment later. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got a lot from that. And I really hope, because I'd love to get you into the Boundary Bootcamp program when it opens, especially if those good questions to ask yourself resonated and you were going like, yes, I definitely do that, or I don't do that. Are you recognizing in your life that you've got relational fudginess and difficulties? Then the bootcamp is where you will get to really roll up your sleeves, look at where you are, look at the emotional stuff and how to deal with that. You get so many tools in Boundary Bootcamp to work through what has prevented you from stepping into healthy boundaries. Because chances are, if you're like me, because I come from a place where I've had very poor boundaries historically, you kind of know it. It's not like it's a big aha that you need to hold your boundaries. But often it's so difficult to get clear on what you feel. What are your true feelings, or what do you really want? Because there is all this conditioning and emotional dross around it. So within the Boundary Bootcamp, which is, this is one of 43 lessons over 4 weeks, that will help you to start by getting us, I mentioned in that video, self-assessment. That's the first part of it, because you've got to get clear on, where you are right now, what's the situation before we have a firm foundation to move on. In week 2, we move into the, untangling the knots, the emotional clearing. There's some amazing stuff in there. There's like almost like an entire masterclass on, working with core emotions and survival instincts, and how the instincts and the suppression of instincts works with, collapsing our boundaries. In week 3, we go into how to construct a healthy boundary, how to take everything that you've done and get really clear on what your boundaries are, and how to rehearse them. And then again, as I mentioned in this section I've just shared with you, in week 4, we go into how do you communicate that? How do you hold a boundary? How do you deal with resistances? There's a whole lesson, which is a fantastic full, near feature length episode within the Boundary Bootcamp, which is on, dealing with those manipulation tactics, which, we all do. Because when you do start to hold a boundary, especially if you've not been someone who's held it before, then those around you can offer a lot of resistance. So it's great to have the tools and awarenesses of how to, to know what they're up to, even if they don't know really what they're up to, what the game is, and how to stand firm in your boundary, so you can step into a world where you have that clarity, that you have that wonderful sense of clarity in who you are, what you want, in a way that you can have even better, juicier relationships. So you can, get a clear sense of getting what you want, not feeling that frustration, not feeling like you're going to let yourself down all the time, not feeling like you're nobody and don't matter, but I matter, I'm somebody, I'm clear, And it's okay to say, yeah, this works for me and this doesn't. I tell you from my own experience, when you start to really step into that, when you do the work, and it will require work from you to do it, it's laid out step by step. But once you do that, you absolutely come into a place where magic happens. You feel so much better about yourself. You'll feel, like that clarity means that other people respond to you better. Because a lot of the reasons why we feel sort of steamrolled when we've got no boundaries, this has been my experience, is because we're not making ourselves matter, and people, we teach people how to treat us. So we can get all that inner resentment boiling inside. It's very unhealthy dynamic. But once you're okay with yourself, once you're okay and you're clear on what you know and you can communicate that well, people actually, rather than, again, those myths is, oh, you're being difficult, you're being belligerent, people respond really well. Ask yourself, when you know somebody who's really clear on what they want, not in a way which is trying to force or control you, but they're just very clear in what works and what doesn't. Don't you like those people? Don't you respond? Don't you find yourself, whereas you might not be particularly respecting of someone else's time who hasn't got clear boundaries, someone who's clear, you just go, oh yeah, well, it doesn't work for them to do it that way, so I'm fine. So imagine you can come into that place where you are the person that people have just an innate, not an awkward one, but just or it's just a normal, oh yeah, of course, it's fine. That person, you're cool, you're like, what you want, and it's clear, and everybody knows where they are, and things just flow. It's a wonderful thing. All right, so make sure that you get notified when the launch goes live, and you get a chance to have that insane offer I'm going to make when I first launch it, just for a very, very short amount of time. Then make sure you get on the Boundary Bootcamp waitlist. You can go to the show notes for today, which is www.beabrillianthuman.com/43. You can go to the main beabrillianthuman.com website, or joelyoungmpa.com will also have links there to it. And do that. If you've got any kind of boundary issues, it doesn't commit you to anything. It just says you can be notified and find out all about it when I start the full launch very, very soon. So hope you enjoyed this episode. If you've enjoyed it, go tell someone about it. Let someone know. Do you know someone who has poor boundaries and probably can admit it to themselves? Send them a link to this episode, or tell them about the podcast in general. They can always find the latest episodes, and all the episodes, in fact, on the website. So you can give them the URL for that, www. I can never say www without making an effort. .beabrillianthuman.com, and they can find information there. And otherwise, have a fantastic day, a fantastic week. Thanks so much for spending this time with me, and I will see you next week. All that remains is to cue the moo.